Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Valerie Segrist, and I'm a member of the Muckleshoot Indian Tribe, which is located just 30 miles south of Seattle at the base of the beautiful Mount Rainier, and we're in between the Green and White rivers. I work as a community nutritionist and a native foods educator, and for the past several years have coordinated the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty Project. And when I first heard that term, food sovereignty, I thought, does that mean that plants and animals will have treaty rights and reservations? And because, in tribal communities, that term sovereignty really carries significant meaning. It means it's what upholds our right to practice our culture. And so I was perplexed at the idea of food upholding its right to practice culture, and decided to research the term and found that it was a term that was coined in the early 1990s by a group of peasant farm workers called La Via Campesina. And they define it essentially as the right of a community to define its own diet and therefore shape its own food system. And that was really inspiring for me to think about as how people can become change agents in their own food system. So, but at the same time, really felt that tribal food sovereignty carried a different meaning, something unique. And I wanted to really take a look at that specifically to our region. So I spent some time researching ethnographic accounts. I have been collecting stories and teachings from my community for the last several years. And through research and applied practice, here's what I've come up with. In 1855, when my ancestor Pat Canham met with other tribal leaders and Governor Isaac Stevens to sign the Treaty of Point Elliott, he was the very first person to speak. And the very first thing that he spoke to was access to foods. We wanted access to all of the game, the fish, the shellfish, the roots, the berries, and the cedar tree. And so at the very moment when my ancestors were defining sovereignty, it is clear that the first priority was access to foods. So at the core of tribal sovereignty is food sovereignty. And this is significant because we know that our traditional foods are a pillar of our culture and that they feed much more than our physical bodies. They also feed our spirits. And this is because they're a living link with the land and with our legacy, helping us to always remember who we are and where we come from. Well, for the Coast Salish people, we see our traditional foods as more than just our foods and medicines. They're also our greatest teachers, and they teach us without a spoken word, which is much different than what we're used to today, or like what I'm doing today, where I'm standing here telling you about what I think food sovereignty means. They teach us by example, without a spoken word, and that's one of the most powerful teachings that could ever be given. So an example of that, a couple of examples would be that, every year we have these seasonal runs of ulican, or smelt fish, that would return to the rivers. And my elders tell me that when these fish would return to the river, they would be so abundant that the waters would look like they were boiling. And that when the herring would spawn, the Blue River waters would turn a milky, creamy color. So we also have these runs of salmon here in the Northwest, where they would return traditionally upon the millions. And my elders tell me that these runs were so abundant that you could walk across the river by walking across the backs of those returning salmon. And the Coast Salish people see this return as an act of love and a demonstration of generosity and a teaching of abundance. And so we ask ourselves how we might live a life of such love and generosity and abundance as the salmon people do. We have the cedar tree in our culture, or what we call long life giver, who provides us with everything we need to survive in this world. Canoes for transportation, housing materials, basketry materials, clothing, medicine, and the aroma of all that is sacred in this world. Cedar tree stands tall against the fierce storms, side by side with other nations of tree people, taking root and holding the earth together, living its life as a teaching for those to come in the future, for all of us. And so we see this, and we ask ourselves how we might live in such a way where the story of our life is told as a teaching for those to come in the future. We have these really diverse lands here in the Puget Sound. These large mountain ranges that produce these fast-running rivers that flow to the waters of the Salish Sea. And in some places, it is just 50 miles from Whitecap to Whitecap. And within that short stretch of land, those rivers nourish our ancient food forests, our mountain berry meadows, our lilybulb prairies, and our rich shellfish gardens. We have a bond, one that is woven right into the social fabric of who we are, and that is with this land, with the Whitecap to the Whitecap. And we see this as a teaching of diversity and abundance. We know that pre-contact, nearly 300 different kinds of foods were eaten in a Coast Salish diet, which is very different from the westernized and superimposed diet many tribal folks consume today, which consists of anywhere between 13 and 20 different foods per year. We live in a time where these sacred friendships are threatened. The colonization and changing landscape of the Pacific Northwest has left us with less than 2% of our prairie lands. Our mountain berry meadows are dwindling every year as a result of poor harvesting practices, climate change, and the disregard of traditional ecological land management knowledge, which is inextricably intertwined with our cultural practices. These sacred friendships are being threatened. And, we have salmon runs that are dwindling every year. And archaeologists recently researched and found that the salmon has been a cultural keystone species for the Coast Salish people for back 10,000 years. 10,000 years, which is such an incredible demonstration of sustainable fisheries and an illustration of the depth of knowledge that tribes carry around fish management. 10,000 years is a tremendous amount of time, and we may be the generation that watches the last salmon come up the river. We have a tremendous amount of work to do. So it's, a loss of land, a loss of rights, a loss of knowledge, environmental toxins, cultural oppression, and a modern lifestyle that impedes our access to our traditional foods. And that is the important work of the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty Project. This is a project that has emerged from our community and an attempt to overcome our barriers and increase access to our traditional foods. So we do this by using our community foods and medicines as an organizing tool. And we hold edible educational workshops and create platforms for tribal members to come and share their gift. And we see traditional food knowledge as a gift. So that means that if you know how to fillet a salmon or prepare an earthen oven, that knowledge is valued and brought out as a teaching for those who want to learn. We work with our tribal cooks to develop healthy food protocols that can be implemented from the daycare to the senior center. And some of those protocols include things like eating a traditional foods meal one day a week and menus inspired by local seasonal availability. We prioritize purchasing from community food producers like our tribal fishermen. And that's important because every year it's getting harder and harder to maintain a livelihood as a tribal fisherman. And once this Muckleshoot told me that he would be nobody without his fishing, that he tried to get a 9-to-5 once and became severely depressed. So the act of harvesting, hunting, and preparing our traditional foods are more than just feeding hunger and a sense of identity. It's also about our mental health and our own self-worth. So these are just a couple of examples that are happening in our community. And when we do hold our events, we always ask an elder to come and witness the work that we're doing. And their testimonies become our guiding light and our inspiration to continue our work in our community. So a couple of years ago, we installed an orchard at the Muckleshoot Tribal School. And I arrived there and found our honored elder standing on top of a pile of wood chips with all these little Muckleshoots running around, throwing dirt at each other and playing in their new garden. And she turned to me with these huge tears in her eyes and said, this young man had just come to her and shared with her his experience planting a native crabapple tree, and that he learned that if we take care of this tree, it will live to be over 200 years old. And this young man said to his elder, that means that this tree will be feeding people long after I'm gone. And she said to me, I get it. I understand why this work is so important. And this story to me is the essence of cultural teachings. Here we have this young man who's outdoors, playing in the dirt, getting his hands in the dirt, getting to know a plant, and in that moment, experiencing a profound lesson of reciprocity and forward thinking. And then he was able to share that with his elder. These are the moments of healing that we're hungry for, and this is the medicine that we truly seek. So I'd love to tell you about all the other work that's happening in tribal communities throughout the Salish Sea, because we're just one example. But quickly, I'll run through that 3 examples. The Lummi tribe, Vanessa Cooper, a tribal member, has been coordinating with several Lummi families who receive community-supported agricultural boxes weekly. They meet and they do recipe sharing and talk about their dietary changes together as a group. The Nisqually tribe has an incredible community gardening program that grows fresh produce for their community members. And Tulalip has an impressive Growing Our Groceries garden program at the Hebulb Cultural Center. And these are just some examples of numerous accounts of tribes rising up to overcome barriers, increase access to their traditional foods, and celebrate our food traditions in the process. So recently, somebody asked me, what do you think that this traditional foods movement is hungry for? And after some thought, I said, for us to remember. We're not doing anything new. This is just about remembering what we already know to be true and right. And then more importantly, sharing those memories in a way that promotes active citizenship and promotes us being active in our own food system. So I think about how important it is to remember those things, because it's feeding a hunger. And as we all know, when you feed something, it grows. So in closing, I'm remembering the teachings of the Salmon people who ceremoniously return to their ancestral rivers every year, and how they are the nation of people who are truly committed to life eternal. I'm remembering the teachings of the plants and the trees, taking root and in all their diversity, standing in solidarity, holding the earth together, and living their life as a teaching for those to come in the future. I remember that when we take better care of the land, we are ultimately taking better care of ourselves. And finally, I ask you to remember these teachings and the environment that we live in, and how precious it is, and how worth caring about it is, and how you too are precious and worth caring about. Thank you.